I built our family business from a struggling local operation to a national success, only to discover my parents had secretly transferred full ownership to my younger brother during my humanitarian mission abroad. They didn't even tell me until I returned. But when the board of directors finally met, a stunning revelation turned everything upside down. My brother had been systematically dismantling everything I'd built, and a document I never knew existed was about to change our family forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The flight from Nairobi to Chicago felt interminable. 18 hours in the air after 2 years directing clean water initiatives across rural Kenya had left me physically exhausted but mentally exhilarated. I'd accomplished exactly what I'd set out to do: help establish sustainable access to clean water for over 30 communities, while training local teams to continue and expand the work. Now I was ready to return to TriStar Solutions, the environmental consulting firm my grandfather had founded, and that I had helped transform from a small regional operation into an industry leader. As the plane began its descent into O'Hare, I scrolled through the dozens of congratulatory messages from my team at TriStar. "Can't wait to have you back at the helm, Alex," wrote Diane, our brilliant head of research. "The innovation department hasn't been the same without you," said Marcus, my longtime friend and our chief technology officer. Their messages warmed me, easing the conflicted feelings about leaving Kenya. I had made the right decision to come home. My younger brother Ryan was waiting at the arrival gate, his usual confident smile somewhat strained. We embraced awkwardly. Ryan had never been comfortable with physical affection, even as children. "Good flight?" he asked, taking one of my eggs. "As good as 18 hours in economy can be," I replied. "Where are Mom and Dad? I thought they'd be here." "They're waiting at home. Dad wasn't feeling well this morning, and you know how Mom gets." Something in Ryan's tone made me glance over. At 34, 2 years my junior, Ryan had always been the more conventional sibling. Business school at Northwestern followed, by immediate entry into the family company. While I had pursued environmental science with a passion that sometimes baffled my parents, ultimately bringing those skills back to revolutionize TriStar's approach to sustainability consulting. "Is Dad okay?" I asked, concerned. "Just the usual heart stuff, nothing serious." Ryan's eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. "They're excited to see you." The drive to my parents' lakeside home in Evanston was filled with my questions about the company and Ryan's increasingly vague responses. He deflected with questions about Kenya, which I answered enthusiastically at first, then with growing suspicion as I realized he was deliberately avoiding discussing TriStar. "Ryan, what's going on with the company? You're being evasive." He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Let's wait until we're with Mom and Dad. There have been some changes while you were away." My stomach tightened. "What kind of changes?" "Alex, please, we're almost there." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in my parents' sunroom overlooking Lake Michigan, a cup of untouched tea growing cold in my hands as I struggled to process what they had just told me. "You did what?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "My father, Michael Davidson, once imposing at 6'2", but now somewhat diminished at 72, leaned forward in his chair. "We transferred majority ownership of TriStar to Ryan last year. It was time to formalize the succession plan. Without consulting me, I was temporarily away on a humanitarian mission that everyone supported and encouraged. I didn't abdicate. My position in the company." My mother, Eleanor, always the practical voice in family discussions, intervened. "Alex, you chose to leave for 2 years. The company needed clear leadership." "I set up everything before I left." We had quarterly virtual strategy meetings. I was in constant communication with the executive team. The company was thriving under the structure we established. Ryan cleared his throat. The board felt we needed someone physically present, making day-to-day decisions. The board? I echoed. Since when does the board make decisions about ownership of a family company? My father and Ryan exchanged glances. We restructured while you were away, my father explained. Brought in outside directors to provide objective governance. Standard practice for companies of TriStar's size. Nothing about this conversation was making sense. The family business had always been just that. Family. My grandfather had started it, my father had expanded it, and I had modernized it, creating the innovative sustainability division that now generated 60% of our revenue. And none of you thought to consult me about any of this? Or even inform me? We tried to call you several times, my mother said, her tone defensive. Reception was often poor in those remote areas. Email exists, Mom. Video calls. I managed to conduct business meetings from villages without running water. You could have reached me if you truly wanted to. Ryan stood up abruptly. This isn't productive. What's done is done. The ownership transfer is legally binding. I'm CEO now, and I've made some significant changes to our strategic direction. The cold certainty in his voice sent a chill through me. What kind of changes? We're moving away from the sustainability consulting model. It's too specialized, too dependent on regulatory frameworks that could change with each election. I've refocused us on traditional environmental compliance, steadier, more predictable revenue. I felt physically ill. The sustainability division wasn't just financially successful. It was making a genuine difference in how companies approached their environmental impact. We had helped dozens of corporations implement truly transformative practices that went far beyond mere compliance. That division is our future, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. It's not just profitable, it's actually creating meaningful change. You can't just dismantle it. I already have, Ryan replied, not meeting my eyes. We've let go of most of the innovation team and reassigned the others. The market wants reliability, not idealism. My father raised a hand to silence my protest before it could begin. Ryan has full authority to make these decisions, Alex. The board has approved his strategic vision. What board? I demanded. Who are these people who've decided to erase everything I built? You'll meet them tomorrow, my father said. There's a quarterly meeting scheduled. You're still on the board, of course. We would never completely remove you from the company your grandfather founded. But you need to understand that things have changed. Ryan is in charge now. The room fell silent. Outside, Lake Michigan stretched calm and indifferent to the betrayal unfolding in the house that overlooked it. I stood up, no longer able to sit still with the weight of what I'd learned. I need some air. No one tried to stop me as I walked out onto the beach. The late September wind whipped across the water, matching the turbulence I felt inside. How could this have happened? I had spent 10 years transforming TriStar from a conventional environmental compliance firm into an industry leader in corporate sustainability. Our client list included Fortune 500 companies committed to meaningful environmental change. We were making a difference while being more profitable than ever. And in just 2 years, while I was helping communities access clean water, my family had erased my contribution, my vision, my place in the company I loved. They had handed everything to Ryan, who had always been skeptical of my idealistic approach to business, who had always played it safe, followed the conventional wisdom, measured success purely by quarterly profits. I picked up a stone and hurled it into the water, watching the ripples spread and dissipate. That's what they wanted for my impact on TriStar, to disappear without trace, replaced by Ryan's more practical approach. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from Diane. Heard you're back. We need to talk before tomorrow's board meeting. Critical information. Coffee at Lakeside Brew, 7 a.m. I texted back immediately. I'll be there. What's going on? Her response was cryptic. Not on text. Just come tomorrow. and Alex, I'm so sorry about what they've done. So Diane knew. Who else had been aware of this betrayal while I worked? 14-hour days in Kenya, still believing I was building something to return to? I walked along the shoreline until sunset, trying to process everything. By the time I returned to the house, my parents had gone to bed, and Ryan had left. Phew. Note on the kitchen counter provided the address of my Airbnb. Apparently, they hadn't expected me to stay in the family home. Another small rejection that suddenly made perfect sense. That night, lying awake in an impersonal rental apartment, I tried to understand how we had come to this. Had I been naive to believe that my family valued my vision for the company? Had I misinterpreted their encouragement of my humanitarian work, seeing support where there was really opportunity, a chance for them to reshape the company without my interference? One thing was increasingly clear. Tomorrow's board meeting wasn't just a formality. Something was happening behind the scenes that even Ryan didn't fully grasp. Diane wouldn't risk reaching out if this were simply about ownership changes that had already occurred. Whatever revelation awaited me at Lakeside Brew tomorrow morning, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I might have lost ownership of TriStar, but I wasn't about to abandon the mission that had driven me for the past decade. One way or another, I would find a path forward. For myself, for my team, and for the vision of business as a force for positive change that had always guided me. Sometimes the deepest betrayals become the foundation for our greatest transformations. I just didn't know yet what form that transformation would take. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning dawned, with a crystalline clarity that felt at odds with the turbulence in my mind. Lakeside Brew opened at 6:30, and I arrived precisely at 7 to find Diane already waiting, hunched over her laptop at a corner table far from other patrons. Her normally impeccable appearance, she was known for tailored blazers and statement jewelry, even on casual Fridays, had given way to what looked like yesterday's clothes and a hastily arranged ponytail. "You look like I feel," I said, sliding into the chair across from her. Diane's eyes darted around the cafe before focusing on me. "I've been up all night pulling documentation together." She pushed a flash drive across the table. "Everything's on here, but I'll give you the condensed version because we don't have much time before the meeting." She took a deep breath. 3 months after you left, Ryan began systematically dismantling not just the sustainability initiatives, but the entire corporate governance structure you put in place. The new board members? They're all old fraternity brothers or golf buddies of your father and Ryan. There's not a single independent voice among them. "That can't be legal," I protested. "We had bylaws specifically preventing that kind of cronyism." "They changed the bylaws," Diane said flatly. "As majority shareholders, they could. But that's not even the worst of it. 6 months ago, Ryan secured a major contract with Meridian Petroleum, $40 million to help them navigate environmental regulations for their new fracking operations in protected watersheds." The irony was almost too much to bear. While I'd been building clean water access in Kenya, my own family company had begun helping corporations potentially contaminate water sources in our own country. "But wait," I said, struggling to process this information. "We had an explicit company policy against working with fossil fuel extraction. Dad agreed to that when I took over the sustainability division." "All those policies were quietly rescinded," Diane replied. "And here's where it gets complicated. Ryan didn't just change our client criteria. He's been actively recruiting our sustainability clients away from their commitments. Remember GreenPath Technologies? Their ambitious net zero plan that we helped develop?" I nodded. GreenPath had been one of our greatest success stories, a manufacturing company that had transformed its entire production process under our guidance, reducing emissions by 78% while actually increasing profitability. Ryan convinced their CFO that they were moving too fast, taking on too much risk. He presented a new, practical plan that essentially guts all the meaningful changes, but still lets them claim they're working toward sustainability goals. It's corporate greenwashing, pure and simple, and we're now enabling it. My stomach clenched. How many clients has he approached like this? At least 17 that I can document. Most have scaled back their commitments significantly. A few are holding firm, but they're under tremendous pressure. Carter at Sunstream Innovations called me last week, asking what happened to our company's values. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to grasp the magnitude of the destruction. It wasn't just my position that had been erased. It was the entire mission I'd built, the reputation for integrity that had distinguished us in an industry often plagued by empty promises and superficial solutions. Why didn't anyone tell me sooner? Diane looked down at her coffee. Ryan made it very clear that anyone who contacted you would be immediately terminated. Most of the team was afraid to risk it. Mortgages, kids in college, medical bills. I almost didn't reach out myself, but... She looked up, her expression resolute. What we built together meant something. It wasn't just a business strategy. It was making a genuine difference. I couldn't just watch it be destroyed without at least trying to fight. I appreciate your courage, I said sincerely, but I'm not sure what I can do. They've made it pretty clear that ownership has transferred to Ryan. I don't have the authority to reverse any of these decisions. A hint of a smile appeared on Diane's exhausted face. That's where things get interesting. I was reviewing the original transfer documentation, the papers that gave Ryan control of the company. There's something strange about them. She pulled out her tablet and opened a document, turning it so I could see. This is the ownership transfer your parents executed. Notice anything unusual about page 4? I scanned the document, my eyes catching on a clause that seemed oddly specific. Transfer of majority interest is contingent upon continued adherence to the company's core mission as established in the Corporate Charter and Vision Statement of 2018. The Vision Statement of 2018, I repeated slowly. That's the one I wrote when we restructured the Sustainability Division. Diane nodded emphatically. Exactly. The one that explicitly commits the company to refusing projects that contribute to environmental degradation, including, but not, limited to extraction of fossil fuels in protected or vulnerable ecosystems. The one that pledges to hold ourselves and our clients to the highest standards of genuine environmental responsibility, not merely compliance with minimum regulations. For the first time since landing in Chicago, I felt a flicker of hope. So you're saying the transfer to Ryan isn't valid if he's violated those core principles? I'm not a lawyer, Diane cautioned, but that's my reading of it. I don't think your father realized the implications when he included that clause. He probably thought it was just ceremonial language honoring the family legacy. But legally speaking, it creates a conditional transfer. If Ryan has violated those conditions, which he absolutely has, then the transfer itself could be challenged. I stared at the document, mind racing through possibilities. We'd need solid evidence that the current operations violate those specific commitments. Diane's smile widened as she tapped the flash drive. 2 years' worth. Every policy change, every client meeting, every revised sustainability plan that walks back meaningful commitments. I've been documenting everything. Why would you take that risk? I asked, genuinely moved by her loyalty. Because some things matter more than job security, she replied simply. What we were building together wasn't just profitable, it was right. It was making a real difference in how businesses approach their environmental impact. I wasn't going to let that die without a fight. I checked my watch. The board meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Just under 2 hours away. Thank you for this, Diane. Truly. But I need to figure out how to use this information effectively. If I just walk in and start making accusations, They'll close ranks immediately. I thought about that too, she said, reaching into her bag and pulling out another file. That's why I brought this. It's the agenda for today's meeting. One of V. The items is a formal vote on the Meridian Petroleum contract. They need board approval for a contract of that size, even with Ryan as CEO. I scanned the agenda, mind working through strategic options. So if I can convince the board that this contract violates the vision statement, and then connect that to the ownership transfer conditions. Exactly, Diane confirmed. You need to make them see that this isn't just about you versus Ryan. It's about the legal validity of the entire leadership structure. If the transfer to Ryan is invalid because he violated its conditions, then all of his subsequent decisions could potentially be challenged as well. We spent the next hour reviewing the documentation Diane had compiled, identifying the strongest evidence of deviation from the company's stated mission and values. By the time we finished our third cups of coffee, I had a clear strategy for the meeting ahead. There's one more thing you should know, Diane said as we gathered our materials. Not everyone at TriStar has accepted the new direction. Most of the sustainability team is still there, trying to work within the constraints Ryan has imposed, but fundamentally uncomfortable with the changes. Marcus has been running interference, protecting the most committed team members from Ryan's cuts. If you can turn this around, you'll have support within the company. This revelation strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about my position or even my family legacy. It was about the dozens of dedicated professionals who had believed in our mission and were now watching it be systematically dismantled. What about my parents? I asked, the personal dimension of this conflict weighing heavily. Do you think they understand what Ryan's really been doing with the company? Diane hesitated. I don't know for certain. Your father hasn't been actively involved in day-to-day operations since his health declined last year. Your mother occasionally attends board meetings but rarely speaks. My sense is that Ryan has been filtering what information reaches them, portraying his changes as minor adjustments rather than fundamental redirections. This aligned with my own assessment of the family dynamics. My father had always been proud of TriStar's reputation for integrity, established well before I introduced sustainability as a focus. My mother, while more practical about business, realities, valued honesty above all else. If they truly understood how Ryan was compromising those values, they might not support him so unequivocally. As we left the cafe and headed toward our cars, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at the betrayal, determination to right these wrongs, anxiety about confronting my family publicly, and a flickering hope that perhaps not everything was yet lost. Whatever happens in that boardroom, I told Diane, I want you to know how much I appreciate your courage and loyalty. Regardless of who officially owns TriStar going forward, those are the values that make a company truly valuable. She nodded, her expression serious. Just remember when you walk in there, this isn't about getting your position back or winning a family power struggle. It's about protecting something that matters. Keep the focus on the mission, not the personalities. It was excellent advice. As I drove toward the TriStar headquarters building, the LEED Platinum certified structure that had been one of my first major initiatives after taking over the sustainability division, I rehearsed my approach. I wouldn't walk in with accusations or personal grievances. I would simply present the facts, connect them to the legal conditions of the ownership transfer, and let the board members draw their own conclusions. Whether this strategy would succeed remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: the board meeting that my family had intended as a mere formality, a way to officially welcome me back while firmly establishing my diminished role, was about to become something much more consequential. By the end of today, the future of TriStar Solutions would be decided, not just who would lead it, but what values would guide it going forward. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought for personal gain, but for principles that transcend individual interests. As I pulled into the parking garage, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Whatever happened next, I would know I had stood for something larger than myself, the belief that business could and should be a force for positive change in the world. The TriStar Solutions headquarters lobby hadn't changed during my absence. The living wall of native plants still thrived beneath carefully positioned skylights. The reception desk was still crafted from reclaimed timber salvaged from a historic Chicago building, and the company mission statement still gleamed in brushed metal letters along the main wall. Creating sustainable solutions for a thriving planet and prosperous businesses. Several employees did double takes as I crossed the lobby, their expressions shifting from surprise to something more complex. Hope mingled with caution. Word of my return had clearly spread. A young woman I didn't recognize approached hesitantly. "Ms. Davidson, I'm Zoe Mercer. I joined the innovation team 6 months ago." She glanced around nervously before continuing in a lower voice. "We've all been hoping you'd come back. The company isn't the same without your leadership." Before I could respond, the elevator doors opened, and Ryan emerged, his expression darkening when he spotted me talking with Zoe. "Alex, I see you're already making the rounds." His tone was cordial, but carried an unmistakable warning. "The board is gathering upstairs. We should join them." Zoe retreated immediately, murmuring, "It was nice to meet you," before hurrying back to her desk. "Intimidating the staff now, Ryan?" I asked quietly as we stepped into the elevator. "Setting appropriate professional boundaries," he corrected, straightening his already impeccable tie. "Something you were always too casual about." The elevator ascended to the top floor in tense silence. When the doors opened, Ryan gestured for me to exit first, a superficial courtesy that couldn't mask the fundamental disrespect of the past 2 years. The boardroom, with its panoramic views of the Chicago skyline, was already filled with unfamiliar faces. Of the 12 people seated around the massive table crafted from sustainably harvested maple, I recognized only 4: my parents, Diane, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod, and Marcus, our technology officer, whose relieved smile confirmed Diane's assessment that I still had allies within the company. My father rose from his seat at the head of the table, a position that had once been mine. "Everyone, I'd like to formally welcome back Alexandra Davidson, who has just returned from her humanitarian work in Kenya. Alex, let me introduce our board members." The introductions confirmed Diane's intelligence. Every new board member had personal connections to either Ryan or my father. The independent governance I had established had been completely dismantled, replaced with a network of loyalists who would rubber stamp whatever direction Ryan chose. "Thank you for the warm welcome," I said, taking the only empty seat, positioned at the far end of the table from my father, a physical manifestation of my diminished status. "I'm eager to hear about the company's current initiatives and contribute however I can." My deliberately mild tone seemed to relax the tension somewhat. Ryan took his seat at my father's right hand and opened the meeting with practiced efficiency, moving through routine matters with a confidence that revealed how comfortable he had become in his role as CEO. My mother occasionally glanced in my direction, her expression unreadable. My father remained focused on Ryan, nodding approvingly at his son's command of the proceedings. I waited patiently, reviewing the documentation on my tablet while maintaining an expression of polite interest. When Ryan reached the agenda item, regarding the Meridian Petroleum contract, I straightened slightly, sensing Diane doing the same across the table. "As you all know," Ryan began, "we've been in negotiations with Meridian Petroleum regarding environmental compliance services for their expanded operations in the Allegheny region. I'm pleased to announce that we've finalized terms for a $40 million contract spanning 5 years. Murmurs of approval circulated around the table. My father's face conveyed unmistakable pride. "This represents our largest single contract to date," Ryan continued. "Given its significance, board approval is required under our bylaws. The complete contract details have been shared in your digital packets. Unless there are questions, I'd like to move for a vote of approval. One of the new board members, a silver-haired man introduced as a former petroleum executive himself, immediately seconded the motion. My father was about to call for a vote when I cleared my throat. I have a few questions, if I may. All eyes turned to me, some curious, others wary. Ryan's expression remained neutral, but I could sense his tension. Of course, Alex, my father said, his tone suggesting this was mere courtesy rather than genuine invitation for substantive inquiry. I've been reviewing the contract details, I began, keeping my voice even and professional. The scope of work indicates that TriStar will be providing environmental compliance strategies for Meridian's hydraulic fracturing operations in 3 watershed areas. Is that correct? Ryan nodded. That's right. It's a significant opportunity to guide responsible resource development. I notice that 2 of these watersheds feed into the Allegheny River, which provides drinking water for over 600,000 people. The third sits above an aquifer that supplies agricultural irrigation for much of the region's organic farming operations. A slight furrow appeared between Ryan's brows. All relevant environmental regulations will be followed. That's what TriStar does. We ensure compliance. Compliance with minimum legal requirements, I acknowledged. But I'm curious how this aligns with our corporate vision statement of 2018, which explicitly commits us to refusing projects that could contribute to environmental degradation, particularly those involving fossil fuel extraction in vulnerable ecosystems. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Several board members shifted in their seats, glancing at Ryan for his response. That vision statement was aspirational. Not binding, Ryan said dismissively. We've evolved our approach to reflect market realities. Interesting perspective, I replied, swiping through documents on my tablet. Because according to the official minutes from the board meeting when that vision statement was adopted, unanimously, I might add, it was established as a binding governance document integrated into our official corporate charter. I turned to my father. Dad, you spoke quite passionately at that meeting about ensuring TriStar would never compromise its environmental standards for short-term profit. In fact, you said it was the proudest moment of your business career, knowing that the company would always prioritize genuine sustainability over mere compliance. My father's expression faltered slightly. Business environments change, Alex. We have to adapt. Absolutely, I agreed. But there are proper channels for changing fundamental corporate governance documents. According to our bylaws, modifying the corporate vision statement requires a supermajority vote of the board and a formal amendment to the charter. Has such a vote occurred? The silence that followed confirmed what I already knew. Ryan had simply ignored these commitments rather than formally changing them, assuming no one would challenge him. This is procedural nitpicking, Ryan said, his calm facade beginning to crack. The board has supported our new strategic direction consistently. I have another question, if I may, I continued, turning to the company's legal counsel, an older woman who had served TriStar for decades and was one of the few figures Ryan hadn't managed to replace. Ms. Winters, I'd like your professional opinion on something. If a transfer of ownership is explicitly conditioned upon adherence to specific corporate governance principles, and those principles are subsequently violated, what would be the legal status of that transfer? Ms. Winters adjusted her glasses, clearly surprised by the question. That would depend on the specific language of the transfer agreement. If the conditions were clearly stated as contingent requirements rather than aspirational guidelines, violation of those conditions could potentially invalidate the transfer. However, this is a highly fact-specific analysis. I nodded, swiping to another document on my tablet. I'm looking at the ownership transfer executed 2 years ago, transferring majority control from my parents to Ryan. Page 4 contains this specific language. Transfer of majority interest is contingent upon continued adherence to the company's core mission as established in the Corporate Charter and Vision Statement of 2018. The room grew utterly silent. My mother's eyes widened, slightly. My father's complexion paled. Ryan's jaw tightened visibly. I turned to Ms. Winters again. Based on that language, if the vision statement explicitly prohibits involvement in fossil fuel extraction in vulnerable watersheds, and this Meridian contract directly contravenes that prohibition, would that potentially invalidate the ownership transfer? The attorney chose her words with deliberate care. Based solely on what you've described, there would be legitimate grounds to question the validity of the transfer under those circumstances. However, I would need to review all relevant documents before offering a definitive legal opinion. I anticipated that, I replied, sending a digital folder to the conference room display. Here is comprehensive documentation of at least 17 client engagements over the past 18 months that directly contravene specific commitments in the vision statement, including internal communications explicitly acknowledging these contradictions. Ryan's face flushed with anger. Who provided you with those documents? That's corporate espionage. It's whistleblower protection, Diane interjected firmly. I compiled this documentation as the company's chief compliance officer, a role that explicitly requires me to flag potential violations of our governance commitments. I continued before Ryan could interrupt further. I'm not presenting this information to create conflict or to stage some kind of corporate coup. I'm bringing it forward because TriStar has spent 3 generations building a reputation for integrity and environmental leadership. That reputation, and the legal standing of our current leadership structure, is now at risk. I looked directly at my father. Dad, did you understand when you transferred ownership to Ryan that he planned to abandon the environmental commitments that you yourself had described as the proudest achievement of your career? My father's expression reflected genuine confusion. Ryan assured us he was making modest adjustments to improve profitability while maintaining our core values. And, Mom, I turned to my mother, whose analytical mind had always cut through emotional complications. Did you review the specific client engagements that Ryan has pursued since taking control? She shook her head slowly. We've been less involved in day-to-day operations, especially since your father's health challenges. Ryan provides quarterly summaries, but not client-specific details. I nodded, understanding the dynamic more clearly. Now, Ryan hadn't just betrayed me. He had manipulated our parents, taking advantage of their reduced involvement to fundamentally redirect the company while presenting it as minor course corrections. I believe we need to pause this meeting, my father said, his voice carrying a gravity I hadn't heard since childhood. Ms. Winters, please review these documents immediately and provide your assessment of their implications for the company's governance and ownership structure. Ryan started to protest, but my father raised his hand in a gesture that brooked no argument. This isn't optional, Ryan. If what Alex has presented is accurate, we have a serious situation that requires immediate legal review. For the first time since my return, I glimpsed the father I remembered. The man who, despite his traditional business mindset, had always valued integrity above all else. Ms. Winters gathered her materials. I'll need several hours to review everything thoroughly. I suggest we reconvene tomorrow morning. My father nodded agreement. The board will reconvene at 9 tomorrow. Until then, all pending contracts, including Meridian, are on hold. As the meeting adjourned, the boardroom filled with tense murmurs. Ryan stalked out without looking at anyone. Several board members clustered around my father, their expressions concerned. Diane caught my eye across the room and gave me a subtle nod of approval. Marcus approached as I gathered my materials. That was unexpected, he said quietly, but necessary. The company hasn't been itself since you left. Whatever happens next, know that many of us have been waiting for someone to finally speak the truth. As I left the boardroom, I felt neither triumph nor vindication. only a profound sense of purpose. This confrontation wasn't about regaining position or power. It was about honoring commitments, protecting a legacy of integrity, and ensuring that TriStar remained true to its mission of creating genuine environmental solutions, not just profitable compliance strategies. The next 24 hours would determine not just who owned TriStar, but what TriStar stood for. And regardless of the outcome, I had already won something precious: the knowledge that I had stood up for principles that transcended personal. And in that moment, I understood that true leadership isn't measured by titles or ownership stakes, but by the courage to defend values even when doing so carries personal risk. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but today, I had remembered who I was and what I stood for. Sometimes, that recognition is the first step toward transforming not just a situation, but oneself. I barely slept that night. The weight of what had transpired in the boardroom and what might follow kept my mind racing through potential scenarios. By 5:30 a.m., I abandoned any pretense of rest and walked to a nearby park, watching the sunrise paint the Chicago skyline in hues of amber and gold. My phone vibrated with an incoming call. The screen displayed Dad, a name I hadn't seen there in months. I hesitated before answering. "Alex? Did I wake you?" My father's voice sounded older, more fragile than I remembered. "No, I've been up for a while." A pause stretched between us, filled with unspoken words and complicated emotions. "I've been up all night reviewing everything," he finally said. "Ms. Winters sent over her preliminary assessment at midnight. She's still working through the details, but her initial conclusion is troubling. The ownership transfer does appear to be legally contingent on adherence to the vision statement principles." I waited, sensing there was more he needed to say. "I spoke with your mother for hours," he continued. "We've been—" His voice caught slightly. "We've been blind, Alex, or perhaps willfully ignorant. Ryan presented everything as minor adjustments to improve profitability. We trusted him because he was physically present, because he spoke the language of business we understood, because he showed us exactly what he wanted us to see. Dad, please, let me finish. This is difficult enough." He took a deep breath. "I didn't seek out the truth about what was happening at TriStar. I didn't question why the sustainability team, people you had carefully recruited and mentored, were gradually disappearing from company events. I didn't investigate when names I didn't recognize started appearing in quarterly reports. I told myself I was stepping back to allow the next generation to lead. But the truth is, I abdicated my responsibility to ensure the company stayed true to its values." His honesty surprised me. My father had never been one for emotional vulnerability or admitting mistakes. "What happens now?" I asked. "That's why I'm calling. Before the board meeting, I'd like to meet with you and Ryan privately. Just the family. 9 o'clock at the house. Can you come?" "I'll be there," I promised, not entirely sure what to expect, but recognizing the importance of the invitation. When I arrived at my parents' lakeside home, Ryan's car was already in the driveway. I steeled myself for confrontation, but when I entered the living room, the scene that greeted me defied expectations. Ryan sat on the edge of the sofa, elbows on his knees, head bowed. He looked up as I entered, and I was shocked to see his red-rimmed eyes and haggard expression. My mother sat beside him, her hand resting consolingly on his back. My father stood by the window, looking out at Lake Michigan. "Alex," my mother said softly, "thank you for coming. Please, sit down." I took a seat in an armchair across from Ryan, the coffee table between us like a demilitarized zone. My father turned from the window. "We've spent most of the night talking with Ryan. There's a lot to address, but I think it's important that he speak directly to you first." Ryan straightened, gathering himself visibly. "I owe you an apology, Alex. Multiple apologies, actually. His voice was rough, as if he'd been talking or arguing for hours. What I've done over the past 2 years wasn't just business strategy, it was personal. I raised an eyebrow but remained silent, allowing him space to continue. When you left for Kenya, I told myself I was stepping up to fill a leadership void. But the truth is, I saw an opportunity to prove something, to prove that my vision for the company was more viable than yours. Ryan looked down at his hands. I've always been in your shadow, Alex. Even before the sustainability division took off, you were the innovative one, the visionary, the one who transformed TriStar from a conventional compliance firm into something revolutionary. This vulnerability from my always confident younger brother caught me off guard. Your approach was working, he admitted. The company was more profitable than ever, clients were enthusiastic, our reputation was soaring. But it wasn't my vision. It wasn't my achievement. So when you left, I convinced myself that I needed to put my own stamp on the company, to prove that my more traditional approach could be equally successful. By dismantling everything I'd built? I couldn't keep the edge from my voice. Ryan winced. I told myself I was being practical, responding to market realities. But I was really trying to erase your influence, to remake TriStar in my image rather than yours. I presented it to Mom and Dad as minor adjustments while systematically undoing your entire approach. My mother interjected gently. We should have questioned more deeply, looked more carefully at what was happening. We failed in our oversight, and we failed you, Alex. The documentation you presented yesterday was illuminating, my father said. I had no idea the extent to which the company had deviated from our core values. Ms. Winters has confirmed that legally, the ownership transfer is indeed questionable given these violations of its explicit conditions. Ryan nodded, accepting this assessment. I've spent the night reviewing the consequences of my decisions, not just legally, but ethically. The Meridian contract would have fundamentally compromised everything TriStar has stood for since Grandfather founded it. And the clients we've guided away from their sustainability commitments, we've betrayed their trust and our own principles. His admission was more than I had expected. I studied my brother, trying to reconcile this reflective figure with the ruthlessly ambitious CEO of yesterday's board meeting. What exactly are you saying, Ryan? He met my gaze directly for the first time. I'm saying I was wrong. Wrong to undermine your vision. Wrong to mislead our parents. Wrong to betray the company's values. And I'm saying I want to make it right, if that's still possible. My father stepped forward. We've been discussing options through the night. The legal reality is complicated, but the ethical path is clear. The ownership transfer was predicated on maintaining the company's core values. Those values have been compromised. Therefore, the transfer itself must be reconsidered. Are you suggesting reversing it completely? I asked, surprised. Not exactly, my mother replied. We're suggesting something more collaborative, a restructuring that honors both the company's values and the contributions each of you can make. My father nodded. Ryan has management strengths that complement your visionary approach, Alex. His attention to operational efficiency, his understanding of corporate governance structures, his ability to navigate traditional business environments. These are valuable skills. But without being anchored to the core values you championed, they led the company astray. What we're proposing, Ryan said carefully, is a joint leadership model. Not as rivals competing for control, but as partners with complementary strengths. You would lead vision and innovation, guiding our overall direction and values. I would focus on implementation and operations, ensuring that vision translates into effective business practices. I leaned back, processing this unexpected proposal. And ownership? Equal, my father stated firmly. 40% each, with your mother and I retaining 20% between us and a board seat to ensure proper governance. But more importantly, We would amend the ownership agreement to make adherence to the vision statement non-negotiable for both of you. Neither could unilaterally change the company's core values without supermajority board approval. It's not about reversing everything I've done, Ryan added. Some of my operational changes have genuinely improved efficiency, but it is about recommitting to the sustainability mission that made TriStar a leader in the first place. It's about combining our strengths rather than seeing them as competing approaches. The proposal was unexpected, but I recognized its wisdom. Ryan wasn't wrong about his operational strengths, just as I knew my visionary approach sometimes needed grounding in practical implementation. The question was whether we could truly work together after everything that had happened. This would require trust, I said carefully. Trust that has been severely damaged. I know, Ryan acknowledged. I can't undo the past 2 years. I can only commit to doing better going forward. The legal reality could force a complete reversal of the ownership transfer, but that wouldn't necessarily be best for the company. This approach gives us both a stake in TriStar's success and ensures neither of us can unilaterally abandon its values again. My mother, always the most practical family member, added, "Before you decide, there's something else you should know. Ms. Winters has been reaching out to some of our major clients, the ones whose sustainability initiatives were scaled back under Ryan's direction. Many have expressed enthusiasm about potentially recommitting to their original goals if you return to guide that work. Including GreenPath," my father noted. "Their CEO called me directly last night after hearing rumors of your return. They've been increasingly uncomfortable with the watered-down approach Ryan implemented and would welcome re-engaging with their original sustainability targets." I studied each of their faces, my father's hopeful expression, my mother's pragmatic concern, Ryan's genuine remorse. The proposal they offered wasn't perfect. Trust had been broken. Relationships had been damaged. The company's reputation had suffered. None of that could be instantly repaired. But I also recognized the opportunity being presented, not just to reclaim my place at TriStar, but to build something stronger than what had existed before. A company that combined visionary values with operational excellence. A leadership model that leveraged complementary strengths rather than pitting them against each other. A family business that honored its legacy while continuing to evolve. If we did this, I said thoughtfully, there would need to be concrete steps, not just promises. The Meridian contract would have to be declined. The sustainability team would need to be rebuilt. Our client relationships would require careful repair. Ryan nodded. I agree completely. I've already drafted a letter declining the Meridian opportunity, explaining that it doesn't align with our core values, and I've prepared a restructuring plan that would restore the sustainability division to its central role in the company. We'd also need to reconstitute the board, I continued. Not to exclude Ryan's appointees entirely, but to balance them with independent directors and sustainability experts who can provide proper governance. Already in progress, my father. Confirmed. Ms. Winters is reviewing candidates who could bring both business acumen and environmental expertise to the board. I turned to Ryan. And most importantly, we would need absolute transparency going forward. No hidden agendas, no parallel strategies, no filtering information to present only what supports our individual perspectives. Agreed, Ryan said. Firmly. Complete transparency in all decision-making, regular joint reviews of strategic initiatives, open communication with the board and with our parents about both successes and challenges. The sincerity in his voice gave me pause. The brother sitting across from me now seemed fundamentally different from the calculating CEO of yesterday's board meeting. Perhaps the shock of potential legal consequences had triggered genuine reflection. Or perhaps, facing the prospect of losing everything, he had finally recognized the value of what we could build together rather than apart. I need to think about this, I said finally. It's a lot to process. My father nodded. The board meeting is at 2 this afternoon. Take the morning to consider everything. Whatever you decide, Alex, we'll support you. We've already failed you once by not questioning Ryan's direction more carefully. We won't make that mistake again. As I left the house and walked along the lakefront, I found myself at a crossroads. I could pursue the legal remedy, force a complete reversal of the ownership transfer based on the conditional language that had been violated. That path would give me control, but would likely fracture the family permanently, and might ultimately deprive TriStar of Ryan's genuine operational strengths. Alternatively, I could embrace this compromise, accept shared leadership, rebuild what had been damaged, and potentially create something stronger than either of us could achieve alone. That path required trust that might not be fully earned yet, but it also offered the possibility of healing both the company and the family. The sunlight danced across Lake Michigan's surface, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted with each passing moment. Similarly, I realized, no decision was permanently fixed in darkness or light. What mattered was the willingness to adapt, to learn, to evolve based on new understanding. Ryan had made serious mistakes, driven by insecurity and ambition, but he had also shown the capacity to recognize those mistakes and commit to a different path. My parents had failed in their oversight, but were now stepping up to help forge a way forward. And I had the opportunity to return, not just as a voice for sustainability, but as a more complete leader who understood both vision and implementation. As I walked, a thought crystallized. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive isn't the one who wronged you, but the one who failed to prevent that wrong, whether that's someone else or yourself. My parents had failed to recognize what was happening. Ryan had deliberately undermined years of my work, but I had also made my own contribution to this situation by leaving for 2 years without establishing stronger safeguards for the vision I had built. True leadership wasn't about assigning blame, but about creating paths forward. It wasn't about being right, but about doing right. And sometimes the most courageous decision isn't to fight for complete victory, but to build bridges that allow everyone to move forward with integrity. By the time I reached the end of the shoreline walk, my decision was made. Not because it was easy, or because all doubts were resolved, but because it offered the best chance to honor what TriStar could be at its best, a force for positive change in an industry too often defined by compromise and short-term thinking. The board meeting that afternoon would mark not an ending but a new beginning, for TriStar, for my family relationships, and for my understanding of what true leadership entails. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them not as a solo crusader, but as part of something larger than myself, a shared vision that combined the best of tradition and innovation, practical reality and aspirational values, individual talent, and collective wisdom. Sometimes the greatest triumphs don't come from defeating others, but from finding unexpected common ground, not in spite of differences, but because those very differences, when properly aligned, create something stronger than uniformity ever could. The boardroom felt different that afternoon. The tension that had permeated yesterday's meeting had transformed into something more complex, a mixture of uncertainty, curiosity, and cautious optimism. Board members spoke in hushed tones as they settled into their seats, clearly aware that significant changes were imminent. My father called the meeting to order precisely at 2 o'clock. Thank you all for reconvening on such short notice. As you know, yesterday's meeting raised serious questions about TriStar's strategic direction and governance structure. Ms. Winters has completed her legal review, and the family has spent considerable time discussing potential paths forward. Before we proceed, I've asked Alexandra to address the board. All eyes turned to me as I stood. I had prepared extensive notes but set them aside, choosing instead to speak directly from conviction rather than calculation. Thank you for this opportunity. Yesterday, I presented evidence that TriStar has deviated significantly from its core values as established in our vision statement, a document that was explicitly referenced as a condition of the ownership transfer to Ryan 2 years ago. Ms. Winters has confirmed that this creates legitimate legal questions about the validity of that transfer. I paused, noting the concerned expressions around the table. However, I'm not here to pursue legal remedies or to force a reversal of the ownership structure. I'm here to propose a different approach, one that honors both TriStar's essential values and the complementary strengths that different leadership perspectives can bring to our company. I outlined the joint leadership model we had discussed that morning: equal ownership shares between Ryan and myself, clearly defined areas of responsibility that leveraged our respective strengths, and governance safeguards to ensure adherence to the company's core environmental principles. This isn't about erasing everything that's happened in the past 2 years, I explained. Ryan has implemented operational improvements that have genuine value. But it is about recommitting to the vision that made TriStar an industry leader. The belief that businesses can achieve financial success while driving meaningful environmental progress. It's about combining visionary direction with operational excellence rather than treating them as competing approaches. As I spoke, I noticed several board members exchanging glances, clearly surprised by this conciliatory approach rather than the confrontation they had anticipated. When I finished, my father turned to Ryan. "Ryan, would you like to address the board?" My brother stood, his usual confident demeanor tempered by a new humility that seemed genuine rather than strategic. For the past 2 years, I've led TriStar in a direction that prioritized traditional business metrics over the values that have defined this company since our grandfather founded it. I justified these changes as practical adaptations to market realities, but the truth is more personal. I wanted to prove that my approach was superior to the sustainability-focused direction Alex had established, even though that direction was demonstrably successful by every meaningful measure. He looked directly at me before continuing. Yesterday's revelations forced me to confront not just the legal implications of my decisions, but their ethical dimensions as well. The Meridian Petroleum contract that I've been so proud of securing would have fundamentally compromised what TriStar stands for. The client relationships I've redirected away from ambitious sustainability goals represent broken promises and missed opportunities for meaningful environmental impact. Ryan turned back to address the full board. "I've already withdrawn from the Meridian contract negotiations, explaining that it doesn't align with our core values. I've drafted a restructuring plan that would restore the sustainability division to its central role in the company. And I've prepared a complete disclosure of all strategic decisions made during my tenure that deviated from the vision statement, so we can begin the work of corrective action where appropriate." His candor appeared to surprise even some of his closest allies on the board. The silver-haired petroleum executive who had so enthusiastically supported the Meridian contract yesterday now looked distinctly uncomfortable. What Alex is proposing, joint leadership model that leverages our complementary strengths, represents the best path forward for TriStar. Not because it resolves the legal questions surrounding the ownership transfer, though it does address those concerns, but because it offers the opportunity to build something stronger than either of us could create alone. A company that combines visionary values with operational excellence, that honors its legacy while continuing to evolve. After Ryan concluded, my father opened the floor for questions. The discussion that followed was rigorous but constructive. Board members raised legitimate concerns about how the joint leadership would function in practice, how decisions would be made when perspectives differed, how clients would perceive this shift in direction. Ms. Winters presented her legal assessment, confirming that the proposed restructuring would resolve the contingency issues in the original ownership transfer while establishing stronger governance safeguards moving forward. Diane outlined early feedback from key clients who had already expressed enthusiasm about potentially recommitting to their original sustainability goals. Throughout the discussion, I noticed my mother observing carefully, her analytical mind, clearly assessing not just what was being said but the underlying dynamics as well. When she finally spoke, her perspective cut through the procedural details to the heart of the matter. TriStar has always been more than just a business to our family, she said. It represents our values, our legacy, our contribution to creating a better future. The arrangement Alex and Ryan are proposing isn't merely a legal solution or a management structure. It's a recommitment to that deeper purpose, with the added wisdom that comes from having navigated this challenging period. She looked at each of us, her husband, her son, her daughter, with clear-eyed affection. No family business survives multiple generations without experiencing conflict and requiring reinvention. The question isn't whether we encounter difficulties, but how we respond to them, whether we allow them to fracture what we've built or use them as catalysts for creating something stronger. Her words seemed to shift the energy in the room. The discussion moved from cautious problem-solving to genuine vision-building, from addressing past missteps to imagining future possibilities. By the time my father called for a vote on the proposed restructuring, the outcome felt less like a compromise and more like a collective commitment to a renewed direction. The vote was unanimous, including support from board members who had been Ryan's staunchest allies. As the meeting concluded, people lingered rather than hurrying away, engaging in conversations that carried a palpable sense of renewed purpose. Even the petroleum executive approached me with unexpected candor. "I've spent 40 years in an industry that often views environmental considerations as obstacles rather than opportunities," he admitted. "Your brother convinced me that TriStar was moving toward a more realistic approach that aligned with that perspective. But listening today has made me question whether that perspective itself needs reevaluation. I'd be interested in learning more about how your sustainability strategies have created measurable business value." This openness to reconsideration from someone I had initially dismissed as an immovable obstacle reminded me that transformation rarely happens through confrontation alone. Sometimes it emerges through creating spaces where people can evolve their thinking without losing face, where new possibilities can be explored without implicit judgment of past positions. As the boardroom gradually emptied, my family remained, my father still in his chair at the head of the table, my mother beside him, Ryan gathering his materials nearby. For a moment, no one spoke, each of us processing the significance of what had just transpired. "Well," my father finally said, a hint of his old dry humor returning. "That was considerably more productive than I anticipated." "The real work starts tomorrow," Ryan pointed out, though his tone carried determination rather than discouragement. My mother nodded. "But the foundation is solid now. Everything else can be built step by step." She was right, of course. The board vote hadn't magically resolved all challenges. Rebuilding the sustainability team would take time. Repairing relationships with clients whose trust had been compromised would require consistent demonstration of renewed commitment. Developing effective processes for joint decision-making between Ryan and myself would involve ongoing negotiation and occasional disagreement. But the fundamental shift had occurred. From competition to collaboration, from parallel visions to shared purpose, from a family business fractured by conflicting ambitions to one strengthened by complementary contributions. As we left the boardroom together, Ryan paused at the door. "I should check in with the operations team about the Meridian withdrawal. They'll need guidance on communicating this change to our project leads." I nodded, appreciating his focus on the practical implications. "I'll reach out to Marcus about reconnecting with the sustainability specialist who left. Some might be willing to return if they understand the company's renewed direction." "Good idea," he agreed. "And Alex, thank you for finding a path forward instead of just holding me accountable for the past. I wouldn't have been so generous in your position." "It's not about generosity," I replied honestly. "It's about building something that matters more than either of our egos. TriStar at its best has always been about that larger purpose." He smiled, a genuine expression that reminded me of the brother I'd known before competition had complicated our relationship. "I've missed working with you. Even when we disagreed, you always pushed my thinking in ways no one else could." "Likewise," I acknowledged. Your operational perspective keeps my visionary tendencies grounded in practical reality. We're better together than either of us is alone, when we're aligned toward the same goals, rather than working at cross purposes. As Ryan headed toward the operations floor, I took a moment to visit my old office, now Ryan's, soon to be reconfigured as we established the joint leadership model. The space had been transformed in my absence, my collection of sustainability, awards and certificates replaced with more conventional business accolades, my plant-filled windowsills now holding sleek modern sculptures. Yet traces of the foundation I had built remained visible beneath the surface changes. The reclaimed wood conference table I had commissioned from a local artisan, the wall of photographs documenting TriStar's community environmental initiatives, the large windows I had insisted on to reduce electricity usage by maximizing natural light. Standing there, I realized that TriStar's journey mirrored my own personal evolution. Just as the company was now integrating seemingly opposing approaches into a stronger whole, I was learning to balance visionary idealism with practical implementation, passion for environmental causes with recognition of business realities, standing firm for essential values with flexibility on execution details. The painful revelation that had greeted my return from Kenya had initially seemed like an ending, the final betrayal that would sever my connection to the family business I had helped transform. Instead, it had become a catalyst for deeper understanding and more authentic connection. Not despite the conflict, but because of it, both TriStar and our family relationships had the opportunity to emerge stronger, more resilient, more genuinely aligned with our highest values. As I left the office to join Diane and Marcus, who were waiting to discuss rebuilding the sustainability team, I carried this awareness with me, that sometimes our greatest challenges become portals to our most meaningful growth, that relationships, tested by conflict, have the potential to develop deeper authenticity than those that remain comfortable but superficial, that organizations forced to confront contradictions between stated values and actual practices can evolve into more integrous versions of themselves. The path ahead would not be simple or straightforward. Transformation rarely is. But standing at this threshold between what had been and what could be, I felt something I hadn't expected to find when I first returned from Kenya. Not just determination or resolve, but genuine hope. Hope for a family business that could truly embody its highest values. Hope for familial relationships that could evolve beyond competition into collaboration. Hope for my own leadership journey as it entered this new, more integrated chapter. Sometimes the most profound growth emerges not from achieving perfect victory over others, but from finding the wisdom to transform conflict into collaboration, to integrate seemingly opposing perspectives into more complete understanding, to build bridges where others might have erected walls. In that integration of different strengths and viewpoints lies the possibility of creating something far more powerful than any individual, no matter how talented or visionary, could achieve alone. 6 months after the pivotal board meeting, I stood at the podium in the company's largest conference room, surveying the assembled crowd of employees, clients, and industry partners. The occasion was significant. The official launch of TriStar's new Sustainable Innovation Center, a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to developing and implementing environmental solutions that went far beyond regulatory compliance. Today marks not just the opening of a new facility, I began, but the recommitment to a vision that defines TriStar Solutions at its core, the belief that businesses can and must be leaders in creating environmental sustainability while achieving financial success. The journey to this moment had been intensive. The morning after the board meeting that restructured our leadership, Ryan and I had begun the painstaking work of rebuilding what had been damaged while preserving operational improvements that genuinely benefited the company. We had established clear protocols for joint decision-making, delineated our respective areas of responsibility, and created transparency measures that ensured neither of us could make significant changes without proper consultation. The results were becoming increasingly visible. The sustainability division had been rebuilt, with most of the specialists who had left under Ryan's leadership returning once they understood the company's renewed direction. Client relationships that had been strained by shifts away from meaningful environmental commitments were being steadily restored, with several major partners recommitting to their original sustainability goals with even greater ambition than before. This innovation center represents our commitment to moving beyond the false dichotomy between environmental responsibility and business success, I continued. Every aspect of this facility embodies that integration, from its net-zero energy design to its collaborative workspaces that bring together environmental scientists, business strategists, and client partners to develop solutions that are both transformative and implementable. I glanced toward Ryan, who stood at the side of the stage awaiting his turn to speak. Our working relationship had evolved substantially over these 6 months. The initial wariness had gradually transformed into genuine respect, as we each demonstrated commitment to our shared vision while honoring our different approaches. We still disagreed at times, sometimes vigorously. But those disagreements now generated better solutions rather than power struggles. I'd now like to invite my brother and co-CEO, Ryan Davidson, to share more about how this innovation center will enhance our operational capabilities while advancing our environmental mission. As Ryan took the podium, I stepped back, observing his confident presence. He had changed in subtle but significant ways since our confrontation 6 months ago. The ruthlessly pragmatic businessman remained, but that pragmatism was now anchored in genuine commitment to our core values rather than expedient compromise. "Thank you, Alex," he began. "As many of you know, I've spent most of my career focused on operational excellence and financial performance. For a time, I believed those priorities were in conflict with the ambitious environmental goals my sister championed. What I've come to understand through our renewed partnership is that true operational excellence isn't about compromising values for short-term gains. It's about finding innovative approaches that allow businesses to thrive precisely because they embrace meaningful sustainability." Ryan gestured toward the architectural renderings displayed on the large screen behind him. This innovation center embodies that integration. Its physical design reduces operational costs while demonstrating cutting-edge sustainability practices. Its collaborative structure breaks down silos between technical specialists and implementation teams, ensuring that brilliant environmental solutions don't remain theoretical, but become practical realities for our clients. Its funding model, with investment from both TriStar and our client partners, creates shared commitment to outcomes that advance both environmental and business objectives. As Ryan continued detailing the operational aspects of the innovation center, I found myself reflecting on how far we had come. The crisis that had greeted my return from Kenya, discovering that my family had transferred the business to my brother, who had systematically dismantled my life's work, had initially seemed like an irreparable breach. Yet that very crisis had ultimately created the conditions for something stronger to emerge, not just for TriStar, but for our family relationships as well. My parents sat in the front row, their expressions reflecting genuine pride in both their children rather than favoring one approach over the other. My father, whose health had stabilized with proper treatment, had taken on an advisory role focused on preserving the company's legacy while supporting its evolution. My mother had joined the newly constituted board, her analytical mind and ethical clarity bringing valuable perspective to governance decisions. After Ryan concluded his portion of the presentation, we invited questions from the audience. A young environmental engineer who had recently joined the company raised her hand. "This integration of approaches sounds impressive in theory, but can you share a specific example of how your joint leadership has created better outcomes than either approach could have achieved alone?" Ryan and I exchanged glances, silently deciding who should respond. I stepped forward. "That's an excellent question. Last month, we were approached by Vertican Industries, a manufacturing company with significant environmental challenges in their production processes. Under our previous divided approaches, Ryan might have guided them toward minimal compliance solutions that prioritized cost control, while I might have pushed for comprehensive sustainability transformations without sufficient attention to their financial constraints. Ryan nodded, picking up the thread. Instead, we brought both perspectives to the table from the beginning. Our joint team analyzed their operations holistically, identifying where targeted sustainability investments could actually improve their bottom line through efficiency gains, where staged implementation could make ambitious goals financially feasible, and where innovative financing approaches could bridge the gap between short-term costs and long-term benefits. The resulting plan, I continued, achieves a 63% reduction in environmental impact over 5 years, more ambitious than typical compliance approaches, while improving their profitability rather than compromising it. That's not a compromise. Between our perspectives, it's a genuine integration that creates better outcomes precisely because it incorporates both operational pragmatism and environmental vision. The engineer nodded, clearly satisfied with this concrete example. As the Q&A session continued, I noticed Diane in the audience, her expression reflecting quiet satisfaction. As our chief compliance officer and the person whose courage had made the crucial documentation available, she had been instrumental in TriStar's transformation. We had recently expanded her role to include serving as liaison between the sustainability teams and operational divisions, ensuring that integration happened not just at the leadership level, but throughout the organization. When the formal presentation concluded, the event transitioned to a reception where clients and employees mingled, exploring the newly completed sections of the Innovation Center. I found myself in conversation with the CEO of GreenPath Technologies, one of our most important clients whose ambitious sustainability initiatives had been scaled back during Ryan's sole leadership. "I have to admit," he said candidly, "when your brother first approached us about adjusting our sustainability goals, his arguments about practicality and risk management were persuasive. It was only when we started seeing the real-world impacts of those scaled-back commitments that we realized what we'd lost, not just environmental progress, but employee engagement, consumer trust, and innovation momentum." "And now?" I asked. "Now, with your renewed approach, we're achieving more ambitious goals than we initially thought possible, precisely because you're integrating visionary targets with practical implementation pathways. The quarterly workshops your team has facilitated, bringing together our sustainability specialists and operational managers, have transformed internal conversations that used to be adversarial into collaborative problem-solving." His perspective validated what I had come to understand through our own experience at TriStar, that the integration of seemingly opposing approaches often creates outcomes superior to either perspective in isolation. This wasn't merely a convenient compromise or an expedient solution to a family business crisis. It was genuinely better business and better environmental stewardship. As the reception continued, I found a quiet moment to step onto the Innovation Center's rooftop garden, a space designed to demonstrate urban agriculture while providing natural cooling for the building below. Ryan joined me there, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "Not a bad turnout," he observed, handing me one of the glasses. "Not bad at all," I agreed. "The client feedback has been extraordinary." We stood in companionable silence for a moment, looking out over the Chicago skyline as sunset painted the buildings in gold and amber. "I've been thinking about Kenya," Ryan said unexpectedly. "What about it?" "The water access projects you implemented there. They're achieving exactly what we're talking about here: practical solutions to environmental challenges that improve lives while remaining financially sustainable. There might be opportunities to expand that work through TriStar, creating a global division that applies our integrated approach to developing regions." I studied my brother's expression, looking for signs that this was merely a strategic suggestion rather than genuine interest. What I saw instead was authentic curiosity and emerging passion. "You've never shown much interest in international development work before," I observed. Ryan smiled ruefully. "I've never allowed myself to. It seemed like your territory, idealistic, focused on impact beyond financial returns. But this past 6 months has helped me recognize that my operational skills could actually enhance that work, not compromise it. The financing models we've developed for domestic clients could be adapted for international contexts. The implementation systems we've refined could make ambitious goals achievable even with limited resources." His sincere enthusiasm touched me deeply. This wasn't Ryan trying to encroach on my domain or co-opt my interests. This was my brother genuinely evolving his perspective, seeing new possibilities for applying his talents toward purposes that transcended pure business metrics. "It's worth exploring," I agreed. "The need is certainly immense, and our integrated approach could bring solutions that are both more ambitious and more sustainable than traditional development models." As we continued discussing possibilities, I realized that our relationship had transcended the carefully negotiated professional arrangement established after the crisis. We were becoming genuine partners who valued each other's distinct perspectives, not despite our differences, but because of them. The tension that had characterized our relationship for years, intensified during Ryan's dismantling of my work, had transformed into creative energy that generated better ideas than either of us could produce alone. The sun dipped below the horizon, the sky deepening toward twilight. Around us, the Innovation Center hummed with activity. Clients engaged in meaningful conversations with our technical teams, employees proudly showcasing their work, board, members observing with evident satisfaction the tangible results of their governance decisions. "We should get back," Ryan suggested. "People will be looking for us." I nodded, but paused before we turned to leave. "Thank you," I said simply. "For what specifically?" he asked, genuinely curious. "For being willing to evolve. For recognizing that integrating our approaches creates something stronger than either of us could build alone. For transforming what could have remained bitter rivalry into productive partnership." Ryan considered this for a moment. "I could say the same to you. You had legal grounds to force a complete reversal of the ownership transfer. You had every reason to hold on to resentment about what I'd dismantled. Instead, you saw the possibility of something better emerging from that conflict." As we rejoined the reception, moving through the crowded space to connect with important clients and team members, I carried a profound sense of possibility. The crisis that had initially seemed like devastating betrayal had ultimately catalyzed transformation in TriStar's approach to environmental business, in my family's relationships, in my own understanding of effective leadership. This transformation hadn't erased the pain of what had happened or magically resolved all challenges. Building genuine integration rather than superficial compromise required ongoing work, honest communication, and occasional difficult conversations. But it had created a foundation for growth that wouldn't have been possible without first confronting the fundamental contradictions that had undermined both the company and our family relationships. Sometimes the path to our greatest contributions requires navigating painful disruptions. Sometimes relationships must break before they can be authentically rebuilt. Sometimes betrayal becomes the catalyst for deeper understanding and more genuine connection. And sometimes the apparent loss of what we've built creates space for something more meaningful to emerge, not in spite of the conflict, but precisely because of what that conflict reveals about what truly matters and what genuinely works. The Innovation Center around us stood as physical testament to this truth, a space explicitly designed to integrate approaches that conventional thinking positioned as opponents, creating outcomes superior to what either could achieve in isolation. In its architecture, its operational systems, and its collaborative structure, it embodied the principle that had emerged from our family crisis, that the most powerful solutions often arise not from choosing between competing values, but from the creative integration of different strengths toward shared purpose. 1 year after the Innovation Center's launch, I found myself in an unfamiliar position, standing before the United States Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. The committee had convened a special hearing on private sector leadership in environmental sustainability, and TriStar's transformation had caught their attention as a case study worth examining. Ms. Davidson, the committee chairwoman began, "Your company has demonstrated remarkable results over the past 18 months. According to the independent assessment submitted to this committee, TriStar's integrated approach has helped client companies reduce emissions by an average of 47%, while simultaneously improving their financial performance. This challenges the persistent narrative that environmental responsibility necessarily comes at the expense of business success. Could you explain how your leadership model has enabled these outcomes?" The question went to the heart of our journey. As I gathered my thoughts, I glanced at Ryan, seated beside me at the witness table. His encouraging nod reflected our shared pride in what we had accomplished together. "Senator, what you're observing isn't simply the result of strong sustainability practices or efficient business operations in isolation. It's the deliberate integration of these approaches, which conventional thinking often positions as adversaries rather than allies. Our leadership structure, with my brother focusing on operational excellence while I guide environmental vision, creates solutions that are both more ambitious and more implementable than either perspective could generate alone." I continued, explaining how our family business crisis had ultimately catalyzed this integrated approach. Without revealing the more painful details of our internal conflict, I shared how the enforced reckoning with competing values had led to the realization that the tension between them could be productive rather than destructive. The transformation began with governance, I explained. We established a board comprising both business leaders and environmental experts, creating the structural conditions for integration rather than siloed thinking. We then redesigned our client engagement process to bring operational and sustainability specialists together from the earliest planning stages, rather than having them work sequentially or in parallel. Ryan leaned forward to add his perspective. "If I may build on what my sister has described, we've found that when operational considerations are treated as constraints on environmental ambition, solutions tend to be limited. Conversely, when environmental goals are treated as obstacles to operational efficiency, sustainability becomes superficial. Our integrated approach positions these perspectives as creative tensions that generate superior outcomes." The committee members listened, with evident interest, several taking notes as Ryan outlined specific methodologies we had developed. What had begun as a reluctant compromise to resolve a family business crisis had evolved into a genuinely innovative approach that was now attracting national attention. "What's particularly noteworthy," I added, "is that this integrated model scales across different industries and contexts. The same fundamental approach that helped a manufacturing client reduce emissions while improving production efficiency also enabled a financial services company to create environmental investment vehicles that outperform traditional portfolios." After the formal testimony concluded, several senators approached us individually with more specific questions. One senior senator with a background in business pulled me aside. "Your testimony was compelling, Ms. Davidson, but I'm curious about something not in the official record. From my experience with family businesses, the kind of leadership integration you've described rarely emerges without significant struggle. What really catalyzed this approach at TriStar?" The question invited a more personal response than my formal testimony had included. After a moment's consideration, I decided that authentic transparency might serve better than polished messaging. "You're perceptive, Senator. The integration wasn't our initial goal. It emerged from crisis. While I was leading humanitarian work abroad, my brother took the company in a direction that compromised our core environmental values. When I returned, we faced not just a business conflict, but a profound family breach." The senator nodded. unsurprised. And yet you found a path forward together rather than apart. Not immediately, I acknowledged. The initial confrontation was painful for everyone involved. But that very conflict ultimately revealed that neither of our approaches alone was serving the company's highest potential. My environmental vision without Ryan's operational rigor risked creating ambitious goals without practical implementation. His operational focus without my sustainability commitment risked achieving short-term efficiency at the expense of long-term impact. Most families in business together never manage that level of integration, he observed. They either maintain superficial harmony by avoiding difficult conversations, or they fracture permanently when conflicts arise. The key was recognizing that our differences, while real and significant, could become strengths rather than obstacles if properly aligned toward shared purpose, I explained. Our family legacy provided that common ground, a business founded on the belief that integrity and innovation could go hand in hand. As we prepared to leave Capitol Hill, Ryan and I shared a car back to our hotel. The city lights illuminated the National Mall as we drove past, the monuments standing as reminders of enduring ideals transcending temporary conflicts. That went better than expected, Ryan observed. I thought the committee would be more adversarial, especially given the current political climate around environmental regulation. I think our approach resonates across political divides, I suggested. We're demonstrating that environmental responsibility can drive business success rather than undermining it. That's a message that appeals regardless of ideology. Ryan nodded thoughtfully. The senator from Wyoming approached me afterward, not exactly known as an environmental champion, but he was genuinely interested in how our manufacturing clients in his state might implement similar approaches without compromising competitiveness. Did you tell him about the Rockland Steel case study? I asked. Rockland had been one of our most impressive transformations. A traditional heavy manufacturer that had reduced emissions by 62%, while improving productivity by 17% through our integrated approach. I did. He asked if we'd consider presenting directly to business leaders in his state. Apparently, there's growing interest even in traditionally conservative regions, particularly as climate impacts affect their operations. This conversation reflected how far we had come from the adversarial positioning that had characterized our relationship before the crisis. Instead of competing to prove whose approach was superior, we now naturally looked for opportunities to integrate our perspectives, each appreciating how the other's strengths enhanced our collective impact. The following morning, we met for breakfast before our flight back to Chicago. As we reviewed the day's agenda, my phone chimed with an incoming call from an unfamiliar international number. Normally, I might have let it go to voicemail given our tight schedule, but something prompted me to answer. Is this Alexandra Davidson of TriStar Solutions? A woman's accented voice came through clearly despite the distance. Yes, it is. My name is Dr. Nadia Kimathi from the East African Environmental Coalition. Your testimony before the Senate committee yesterday was broadcast internationally. Several of our board members found your integrated approach particularly relevant to challenges we're facing across our region. I put the call on speaker so Ryan could hear as Dr. Kimathi continued. We're currently developing a major initiative to address water security across 5 countries, in partnership with both governmental agencies and private sector operators. The traditional approaches have created an unfortunate pattern, either environmentally sound but financially unsustainable solutions, or economically viable projects with inadequate environmental safeguards. Your model of integration might offer a third path. Ryan leaned forward with interest as I replied, That certainly aligns with our approach. What specifically are you proposing? We'd like to invite TriStar to serve as strategic advisor for this initiative. It would involve assessment visits to key watersheds across the region, collaborative planning with local stakeholders, and development of integrated solutions that could be implemented at scale. Given your personal experience, In Kenya and your company's demonstrated expertise in this integration, we believe you could bring unique value to this effort. The opportunity was unexpected, but remarkably aligned with the conversation Ryan and I had shared 6 months earlier on the Innovation Center's rooftop. The international expansion he had suggested, applying our integrated approach to developing regions, was now materializing as a concrete invitation. "This is my brother and co-CEO Ryan Davidson on speaker," I said. "We're both very interested in exploring this further." Dr. Kamathi expressed delight at having both of us engaged, explaining that the initiative's success would depend precisely on the kind of integration we had pioneered: environmental vision coupled with operational excellence, ambitious goals supported by practical implementation pathways. After arranging a video conference for the following week to discuss details, we ended the call. Ryan and I sat in momentary silence, processing the potential significance of this opportunity. From family business crisis to testifying before Congress to international water security, Ryan mused. Not exactly where I imagined we'd be 18 months ago. Life unfolds in unexpected directions, I agreed. When I returned from Kenya to discover you'd dismantled everything I'd built at TriStar, international expansion was the furthest thing from my mind. I was simply trying to salvage what remained of my life's work. And I was desperately trying to prove my approach was superior to yours, even if that meant compromising the values that had defined TriStar for generations, Ryan acknowledged. Neither of us could have envisioned where that conflict would ultimately lead. The East African initiative represented more than just a significant business opportunity. It symbolized how completely our relationship had transformed, from rivals competing for control of a family business to partners whose complementary strengths could address complex challenges across continents. As we finalized our departure plans, my thoughts returned to the dark days immediately after my return from Kenya. The betrayal I had felt upon discovering that my parents had transferred the business to Ryan, who had then systematically undermined everything I had built, had seemed like an insurmountable breach. The confrontation in that first board meeting had appeared to be the end of something, the final collapse of both professional collaboration and family relationship. Instead, it had become the beginning of something far more significant than either of us could have created alone. The very conflict that had threatened to destroy the family business had ultimately catalyzed its transformation into something more impactful, more integrated, and more aligned with its highest purpose. This journey offered a profound lesson about the relationship between crisis and opportunity. The most painful disruptions often create the conditions for our greatest growth, not despite the difficulty, but precisely because of how such challenges force us to question assumptions, confront contradictions, and imagine new possibilities. The family business that had been nearly torn apart by competing visions was now poised to help address one of the most critical environmental and humanitarian challenges of our time: water security across multiple nations. The leadership model that had emerged from our conflict was being recognized not just as a resolution to a family crisis, but as a genuinely innovative approach with applications far beyond our original context. As our car approached the airport, Ryan turned to me with an expression of genuine curiosity. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't gone to Kenya? If we had continued working together at TriStar without that separation and conflict?" I considered his question carefully. "I think we would have maintained a functional but limited collaboration. The deeper integration probably wouldn't have emerged without the crisis that forced us to confront the limitations of our individual approaches. Sometimes things have to break before they can be rebuilt into something stronger," Ryan observed. "Not just business models or operational systems, but relationships too." His insight captured the essence of our journey. The fracture in our family business had created the possibility for authentic reconstruction rather than continued superficial cooperation. The painful confrontation had revealed truths that might otherwise have remained buried beneath polite, professional interactions and carefully maintained family harmony. As we boarded our flight back to Chicago, I carried a profound sense of gratitude, not just for where we had arrived, but for the difficult path that had brought us here. The very experiences that had seemed most devastating had ultimately led to the most meaningful growth. The conflict that had threatened to destroy our family business had instead become the catalyst for its most significant evolution. The international opportunity before us now represented not just a new business venture, but a testament to the transformative power of integrated purpose. By bringing together environmental vision and operational excellence, ambitious goals, and practical implementation, we had created an approach with the potential to address challenges far beyond our original scope. Sometimes our greatest contributions emerge not from the careful execution of predetermined plans, but from our response to unexpected disruptions. Sometimes the most painful betrayals become portals to our most meaningful growth. And sometimes, what appears to be the end of something important becomes, in retrospect, merely the necessary breaking open that allows something far more significant to emerge. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.